Okay, it really pains me to have to do this. But I figured this person would be at least partially open to criticism, but obviously it's not the case. You can go and see and how I responded. I wasn't rude, I wasn't an asshole, but apparently I deserve to be blocked. So there you go. Again, this whole issue is over whether or not the originalist intent is the way to interpret the Constitution. Of course, I also point out that Shane is not a literalist, even though that's exactly what he tries to peg him to be. Even though he bemoans of Shane doing the same to him and pegging him into a position that he does not hold. But I digress. But again, I state that originalism is the way to interpret the Constitution. And he asked me, so are these people who interpret it in other ways wrong? Well, in being consistent, yes, I have to say yes. But when he responds to that, he replies mockingly, well, then go tell that to the U.S. Supreme Court justices. And of course, when I point this out, that he's being mocking and rather addressing my points, he calls me a hypocrite. You got to be fucking kidding me. You have lost your mind, or I don't know what conversation you're in, but you're not obviously present at this one. That much is clear. You're not present at this one. So when I point out, I'm being consistent, now I'm strawmanning him. You asked the question, and I answered, I cannot exactly be consistent and say original intent is the way to interpret something, and then turn around and allow for any interpretation to be good as the next. And of course, he's telling me that I'm strawmanning his position. That's some way that says, I clearly stated there is no one way to interpret the Constitution. I didn't say that there was a way to, that you believed that there is one way to interpret the Constitution. So how exactly is this a straw man? But at least when I claim originalism is the way to do it, I can do it with arguments. I can do it with reason, logic. But he doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't want to hear it. He wants to say that I'm a hypocrite and that I'm strawmanning him, rather than actually talk about the issue. Okay, so let's move on. And then he goes, strawman number 2. I never said that we should interpret it in any way we want to. If you're not offering a method to which to understand and properly interpret the Constitution, or to choose a method, to choose one method over another, you are. Essentially, you are. Because then you're saying that one way is no better than the other, so if Justice A says this is the interpretation, that's fine. If Justice B says this is the interpretation, that's fine. If Justice C turns around and says this is the interpretation, that's fine. Please, 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 please do not turn around and say, well, I'm not saying that they can interpret it in any way they want to. Okay, then fine. Do what I'm doing right now. Offer a method to determine one interpretation as better than the other. Oh, that's right. You don't want to do that. Because it would be politically incorrect, or i.e. arrogant, to suppose that one way is better than another. But really, you're just being having false humility, just being politically correct, and saying in being pluralistic in this way. There's many ways to interpret the Constitution. Yeah, okay, you're not trying to win a beauty pageant here. Grow some balls and pick a way, okay? But of course you don't want to do that. And then you act like, oh, and how do you decipher the meaning of someone who's long dead and no longer can speak to yourselves? You look at their writings, as the originalists stated, so they do. How can you act like you don't know how an originalist does it? You cite from this very same source. It tells you newspaper articles, other papers that they have written, their letters, their notes, the Federalist Papers, the notes from the Constitutional Convention. We have a means to understand what they meant about a particular clause or passage. Take, for instance, the separation of church and state. We get this from the sayings and letters of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. These people had a hand in the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson also had a hand in the First Amendment. And they talk about this in their papers. So we understand the intent of the First Amendment, and we can understand that there is a separation of church and state. You may not be able to do it through these other methods, through literalism, the two forms of literalism, modernism or instrumentalism, or democratic normative enforcement. You may not be able to do the same thing as I just did with this separation of church and state. So, constitutional interpretation is very important. It's not a matter of opinion, as you tried to paint it as. It's not something that affects no one. It affects everybody. Okay? It affects everybody who lives in the United States. So just to turn around and say, well, that's just your opinion, ignores the issue. Completely and utterly ignores the issue. You cannot have a originalist interpretation of a certain clause, then turn around and have a modernist interpretation of the same clause, and then turn around and have a literal contemporary understanding of the same clause. Only one of those can be enforced if those interpretations all come to very different meanings. Only one of them can be enforced. That's mutually exclusive. That's just plain logic. Okay, so this is why I say it. That's why I say it should be. Let me continue on. And so I say this is why we have the amendment process, to either cover something that is unclear or not covered. So, if there's anything unclear or not covered in the Constitution, we can amend the Constitution so it's not. But instead of addressing that issue, you want to say, I'm assuming that the certain parts of the Constitution is clear. What? After quoting me and saying if something is unclear, you're turning around and telling me that I am stating that the Constitution is clear. Who exactly is the one strawmanning now? Because it sure as hell isn't me. Okay, let's continue. Then you want to say that my analogy doesn't work in this, okay? You didn't exactly point out something that is actually substantive. Because the whole analogy is about whether or not you use original intent to interpret something. We all do. In everything we read, if you're smart, at the very least, and not an asshole, you use original intent. You try to understand what is the author of this trying to say. So if I give you a letter that says, buy milk, and you say, well, that could mean anything. I can buy a can of powdered milk. Well, you're being an asshole. Because you understand my original intent, that I want you to go buy a jug of milk. Because you can go back to my previous actions and say, when you told me to go buy milk, okay, I'll go bring back and I'll go get a jug. I'll bring back a jug of milk. Or in some other case where somebody else does that. Okay, so you understand that we do or use original intent. It's just that in interpreting actions of or intentions of people today, it's easier to understand because we're all living in the same context. We're all in the same culture, using all the same language, and hopefully maybe all the same slang as well in its particular uses. And so we can turn around and say, okay, we understand what's saying because we live in this environment. But to go back into the 18th century and then understand that culture in English language may be harder, but at least we're understanding what they meant by it. And that there is a method in order to do it. But of course you want to say, oh, we can clarify with the person today. That's an irrelevant issue. That's an irrelevant issue. If we're uncertain or unclear, as I said, we can amend. It's possible to amend the Constitution. So there is a way to, quote-unquote, clarify the issue. It's just that we can do it today, rather than needing the going back to the original person. Okay, if it's unclear, we can always clarify it ourselves. That's the whole point of the Constitution. But if you want to say that I'm somehow being arrogant and saying, or the originalist way is the only way, well, that's not arrogant. I'm sorry. I can argue from a place of logic. I can argue with good, solid reasons. If give this situation, if there are 3 different interpretations to which they're all exclusive, to which the meaning changes the way something should be enforced, well then mere logic dictates there can only be one way. If you want to turn around and say that you want to use the modernist interpretation as if it was drafted today, what happens in 50 years? Should the way that be enforced change simply because the cultural and the language and the zeitgeist of the day changed? Why? How is that a stable government? If it needs to be changed, then make an argument. Make your case for an amendment to the Constitution. Otherwise, why should it change? At least in originalist terms, the meaning of the Constitution doesn't change just because of time. It changes because it was amended. And that's a problem with modern interpretation, because in different ages things mean different phrases can mean different things. So you're always constantly reinterpreting it. That doesn't work. And then you have the issue of contradictory interpretations. How do you enforce it? How do you enforce one interpretation of the other? The only way is to be like me and finally put the money in your mouth and make a rational decision. Originalist makes sense in the fact that it's consistent. It is good in the way that we do have resources, that we can at least find out some way to interpret it, and that the fact of the matter is, since the Constitution allows an amendment process, we can change it if we need to. But the interpretation or the enforcement of the Constitution doesn't need to change because we just have a different idea today than they did back then. That's ridiculous. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. That isn't arrogant, it's just realistic.